Thank you very much, sir. I would just like to make really 3 points in my opening statement, Mr. Chairman. One, that our economic future in large part depends on our ability to compete in the world economy. That second, and most important, this agreement, when implemented, will create a level playing field in trade, something that I know everyone who has looked at our concerns of the last number of years has called for, and that we have been continually frustrated by our inability to reach that goal. And third, of course, I would like to speak to the concerns over sovereignty. I think it's important that we address those issues, not only for the committee, Mr. Chairman, but I think it's a serious issue for the American people, and they should rest assured that their sovereignty has not been adversely affected in any way. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I will make the point that in fact sovereignty is more protected under the Uruguay round and this implementing legislation than it has been for 47 years under our arrangement concerning the general agreement on tariffs and trade. First, let me turn to our economic future, and depending on our ability to compete in the world economy, I'll make 4 or 5 very quick points. First of all, the Uruguay round amounts to a 40% cut in tariffs around the world. Just last week, the World Economic Forum said for the first time in 9 years we were the most competitive nation on earth. We replaced Japan as number 1. That is something we all can be proud of, frankly, Mr. Chairman. In that regard, it's the largest trading nation in the world, now the most competitive, with our workers being the most productive. If we can reduce tariffs by 40% and then reduce non-tariff barriers, as this agreement does, we have got to be the major winner in this Uruguay round agreement. Number 2, this creates landmark protection, Mr. Chairman, for intellectual property. As you know, that industry is our fastest growing industry in the country. Let me just indicate that just last year in the CD in the music industry alone, they sold 31 billion, a stunning number, $31 billion worth of product, 10 billion here in the United States, 21 billion overseas, and of the 21 billion, 60% was made right here by American workers. I'd just like to focus on Huntsville, Alabama, just for a second, in this CD by Whitney Houston. This CD was made in a plant in Huntsville, as I said, where hundreds of workers guided it from a single studio recording to the product bought by 28 million consumers the world over. The factory includes sales and marketing employees, customer service reps, sound engineers working with technical specs and laser equipment, technicians operating machines that mold and punch the disc, technicians operating machines that apply polycarbonate linings, disc colorists, paint mixers, silk screeners, graphic artists, packers who put the discs in the plastic cases, boxers, loading dock operators, production coordinators, and back office personnel. And I haven't even touched on the pre-production and post-production stages in which U.S. workers, our musicians, writers, mixers, studio producers, technical advisors, wholesale and retail sales clerks, to name a few, made their contribution. Mr. Chairman, these are real people with real jobs. Now let me, by sharp contrast, indicate what I have here in front of me. Here are examples of what can happen if we don't protect intellectual property, and why this agreement is so important, and how it will, in this area as well as every other area covered by the agreement, make sure we play by the same rules. These are pirated copies of Bruce Springsteen's work in Italy. These are pirated copies of The Band, Italy. Here are some pirated copies of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers in Germany, and on and on and on. Mr. Chairman, this is what's happening to U.S. jobs if we don't protect intellectual property. And for the first time in a multilateral trade agreement, we're doing it, and everybody's going to play by the same rules after 5 years. Developing countries have that long, of course, to come up to our standards. This is a critical element in this Uruguay round. I'll mention it a number of times today. I've said it a number of times in the past. I'm sure many of you are tired of hearing it, but I don't think we can say it enough, because it's so much in the U.S. interests. In the agricultural sector, we have made major strides in this agreement. Nearly every agricultural commodity group yesterday came out in favor of this agreement. This agreement does a number of things in that area. It cuts internal supports in Europe by 20%. Because of the '89 Farm Bill, we do not have to cut our supports at all. It cuts export subsidies by 21%. In every commodity group, Europe must cut by volume by multiples more than we have to cut in terms of subsidized product over the next 6 years. It requires tariffication. That means you take non-tariff barriers in agriculture, you give them a number, you begin to reduce it, and what that does is takes the world's most competitive agricultural sector, which is the United States of America, and allows us to get our products into places that we've never gotten them in before. Because of minimum access and current access, for the first time, we're getting rice into Japan, rice into Korea. This is a major, major step forward in agriculture. We reduced a number of sectors in the industrial area to zero tariffs. This is the biggest worldwide tax cut in history, $745 billion, $36 billion tax cut here in the United States by lowering the price of goods to our consumers. Let me just walk over to these charts for 1 second and indicate why this is so important to play by the same rules and to grow our economy by expanding trade. First, let's look at population growth and labor force growth, comparing industrial countries to low-income developing or high-income developing countries. Obviously, as population grows, as economies begin to expand, when you create a middle class, that's where your markets of the future are going to be. So in low-income developing countries and high-income developing countries, they'll grow in population 1.5 to 1.7% over the next number of years. In the U.S., we're at 1, and all other industrial countries at 0.5, nearly zero population growth. Labor force growth, look at high-income developing countries like the Asian and Latin American countries. Their labor force is growing at 1.8. Compare that to the U.S. growing at 0.8. That is a critical number to keep in mind. Now, as the labor force grows, what's going to happen in terms of economic growth? Well, you can see right here. Pacific Basin, excluding Japan, is going to grow 6.9%. The planned economies in transition, Russia, the former Soviet states, Eastern Europe, grow at 5.7 to 6.9%. Latin America at 5.1%. And then you can see the developed countries growing at much slower rate. So you get a growing population, a growing middle class, of course, and a much faster growing economy. What does that mean? Business. It means markets. It means the middle class. It means incredible opportunities for U.S. workers and U.S. business. Now, as we look at U.S. merchandise export growth, we can see where it's occurred over the last number of years. Interesting enough, in Asia, excluding Japan, is our biggest export market today. Latin America is second, Japan is third, Canada is fourth. But more importantly, what is going to happen by the year 2010? Our biggest market will be Asia, including Japan, but Latin America, including Mexico, will be a $232 billion export market by the year 2010. If you add Latin America and Asia together, they will be half of our exports by the year 2010. Now, why have I made this point? For one very simple reason. Up to now, under the agreements that form the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as few as 27, but only as many as 45 countries have adhered to the agreements on standards or subsidies or customs valuation or import licensing or anti-dumping. Only that number of countries. Now, what have the rest done? They have been plastic-free riders. They have created a situation of a non-level playing field. Now, what have we done in the Uruguay round? Very simply, what we've done is we said, everybody is going to play by the same rules. So now in the standards area, 78 more countries will have to adhere to the same standard as the 45 or 123, or 96 more in subsidies, or 89 more in customs valuation, and so on. Mr. Chairman, what we are doing in this agreement is nothing more or nothing less than saying we're going to level the playing field. That could not be more critical to our country, to our workers, to our children and grandchildren, and to our country's economic future. Let me make one more point in that regard. As we become more technologically proficient, which we have, as each worker becomes more productive, which they have become, and if we have a slower growing population and a slower growing labor force, and our economies will never grow as fast because we're a mature economy, we have a problem, but we have to meet it. The problem is if you don't expand your markets, yet you expand your productivity, you naturally lose jobs. It may sound simple, but it's true. Now, here we have an enormous opportunity. The idea is as you become productive and competitive and you make the rules fair, and you're the world's largest trading nation and the biggest economy, and you have businesses that are actually investing and creating new jobs in this economy, we've got to create new markets overseas. Latin America and Asia and others as well. These big emerging markets are our future. They will be our future. Mr. Chairman, whether you like it or I like it, whether it's changed or not, whether it's change is inevitable. Just like on my vacation just about a few weeks ago for 1 week in South Carolina on the beaches near Georgetown, those tides were coming in and I couldn't stop them. My daughter was just delighted, but I couldn't stop it. We can't stop globalization. We're not going to stop interdependence. We have got to make it our friend, and that's exactly what this agreement does. Now, if I could just talk just for a second about sovereignty, and then I'll, of course, be happy to answer any and all questions from you, Mr. Chairman, or members of the committee from both sides. I would like to really address this canard that somehow U.S. sovereignty has been undercut or is threatened by this agreement. Nothing could be further from the truth. If I could just read you from Section 102 of this bill, a sentence that I think we all agree with, which is critical. This bill reaffirms in 102 the primacy of U.S. law. Quote, no provision of any of the Uruguay Round agreements, nor the application of any such provision to any person or circumstance that is inconsistent with any law of the United States shall have effect. I can't imagine how the Congress could be clearer in what this implementing legislation in this round does. Number two, no substantive right or obligation of the United States of America under this agreement can be changed without our consent. That is right in the Uruguay Round agreement. Number three, Mr. Chairman, no ruling by any dispute panel under this new dispute settlement mechanism, which the Congress asked us to come back with. Three administrations, the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, now the Clinton administration, no ruling can force us to change any federal, state, or local law or regulation. Not the City Council of Los Angeles, nor the Senate of the United States can be bound by these dispute settlement rulings. And I think it's critical for the American people to understand that. Number four, in Article 9, the first sentence, what it says about this organization, the new World Trade Organization, which has been kicked from pillar to post, it says this organization operates by consensus. Now, you will say correctly, well, it's always operated by consensus, but that's been de facto, not de jure. This organization legally could have operated by majority rule for 47 years. We've lived with that circumstance. The reality is, given the power of the United States, the European Union, and Japan, it was always in the interest of the organization to operate by consensus. But now, for the first time, It is a matter of the Uruguay Round law and agreement of 123 countries. We operate by consensus. Let me just mention one other area, the protection of human, animal, and plant life. There has been great consternation in some communities in our country that somehow we're undercutting our environmental or conservation laws. They're going to be subject to the whims and caprice of this international bureaucracy. That's just not correct, Mr. Chairman. We can adopt any measures in this country to achieve our chosen level of health and safety in environmental matters. We can maintain more stringent laws than international laws under this agreement. That is specific in this agreement. We're free to set a zero level of tolerance in terms of carcinogens. State and local governments are free to enact their own laws. State and local governments can set more stringent standards. You can't force a change in U.S. law, as I said, due to any dispute settlement ruling in the environmental area or, frankly, any other area as well. In addition to that, we have made some strides. The preamble to the section which involves the environment says we are all committed to sustainable development, and there's a Trade and Environment Committee for the first time that's been set up in a multilateral organization. Mr. Chairman, I would not sit here and be so adamant about how important this is if I didn't believe, and the President didn't believe, this isn't in the best interest of the United States of America. 3 administrations on a bipartisan basis, began with President Reagan, advanced by President Bush, completed by President Clinton, have believed in it, have worked for it, and have fought for it. In the Congress of the United States, both bodies, both sides, a great number of Republicans and Democrats have worked for 8 years to get this done. Not because it's a political issue, not because it's a partisan issue, because it's in the best interest of our workers, it's in the best interest of raising wages, it's the best interest of creating jobs, it's the best interest of raising our standard of living. We need to go forward. We need to lead the world as we always have in trying to make sure we raise standard of living not only here, but around the globe. I look forward to continuing to work with you. I've enjoyed your courtesies and will hopefully can continue to enjoy those, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to your questions.
The record will show that the distinguished ambassador and I started playing tennis together back when I was chairman of the campaign committee in 1972, and we've been friends since, and we continue to be friends now. Most respectfully, Mr. Ambassador, I am just as adamant in my conviction, you use the word adamant, about the best interest of the people of the United States, not just South Carolina, because they try to put you over into Texas, and I'm delighted to be in Texas. But I'm worried about the aircraft jobs, I'm worried about the automobile jobs, I'm worried about the IBM high-tech jobs just as well. Most respectfully, my view comes from a much, much longer experience and a much harder experience in the context that I carpetbagged that Northeast. I used to travel up there all the weekends and be down at number 1 Wall Street in the Irving Trust building on the 32nd floor, talking to the board, bringing that industry in. And we've got the best training, and we've got all the blue chippers and everything of that kind. Now we're not getting the blue chippers anymore. Yes, we're getting the foreign industry, and I welcome that. I made the first trip to Germany. We got 100 German plants, 48 Japanese plants, and what have you. But at the same time, these industries are leaving. Cummins Gear, Pratt & Reed that makes the pianos, United Technologies, not just textiles. Just last month, Baxter Medical in Hemingway is leaving to go to Indonesia. So my hard experience is right there, and it's a much longer experience. And I can tell you, we got in lockstep in your presentation here this morning when you said heartbreak. You had a CD on heartbreak. That's what this thing gives me. I can tell you that right now. Now, going right to the point, let's use this clock because we are glad to have the attendance here, and we want everybody to get around. We've got 2 important witnesses. With respect to sovereignty, you can't have it both ways. You came up here in June, and I've got the exact words, the same you used in your hearings at the Ways and Means Committee: cannot block a dispute settlement ruling. At Rule 23, there's no unilateral action, and the thing about the agreement can't change. You're right. As of this minute, no agreement has changed. That's what we're debating. You want us to agree. I don't want to agree to this because it says here, except as otherwise provided, Article 9, where a decision cannot be arrived at by consensus, the matter at issue shall be decided by voting. And you study it on down, and I'm a good lawyer, and you find out I got one of 116 votes. Castro cancels me. Time we meet. I look at the 83% composition of this particular entity. Emerging nations. They vote against me a majority of the times in the United Nations. Mexico, they want the head of Mexico to be the director. Mexico's voting against us in the United Nations right now 79.9% of the time. So I'm looking as you my client, and I'm advising you, and I said, hold up on this contract. When we heard earlier, we heard that, look, consensus, consensus, consensus. And true, with respect to the United Nations, we'd never relinquish our military or national security to a UN without a veto. In fact, if we didn't have a veto, you'd never get an Israel. And we know that from hard experience. Now, you said heretofore you had to have consensus. Now, to block that dispute settlement ruling, I've got to get a consensus of all 100%. So the shoe is on the other foot. But let me say most advisedly and respectfully, we've heard this before. I'll never forget Ambassador Strauss coming up with the same sing-song, the same thing about billions and billions of dollars to the economy, and the study showed it was 700 million, 100,000 jobs, and it was between, GAO said, 700 and 1,400. So I've learned how to listen to these special trade representatives, and they'll soup them up about thousands of jobs and everything else. And I look back on hard experience the last 10 years, and I'm seeing, wait a minute, we've had an outflow of 3.2 million jobs. We have had an outflow financially, the greatest in the history of any nation anywhere in the world, of 1.4 trillion in our deficits balanced trade. I look at those who are getting jobs are only part-time. Those who are holding the jobs are taking home 20% less pay. And then I'm looking at this GATT crowd, the coalition that we invited up and said, hold up, we'll come later, yesterday. That's the Fortune 500, and I look in Fortune magazine, and I find out for the first, well, I look at this Bob Reich. I was just on a program with him, so I turned to page 95. The Fortune 500 have not added one net new job to the United States in 15 years. Page 95, read it. And then I look at the first 6 months of last year, and under Fortune we've lost 255,000 jobs. I'm not picking up the paper, I'm listening on TV yesterday morning. American Express said 4,800 jobs they were firing, and you can go down the list. You've got the proposition of Kodak with 10,000, Procter & Gamble with 13,000, IBM with 60,000, General Motors with 70,000 firing, aircraft, Boeing, you say I'm for Texas. Look at your country. Boeing, 28,000. We're losing the best of the best, all of these jobs around. And then I look at another Fortune article, and they find out here that they've invested since 1990 50 billion overseas, and the full court press is, yes, for jobs and all that you're talking about, those jobs there. But they're jobs overseas. You say that's a great opportunity. With that opportunity, Korea, a deficit in the balance of trade of 2.3, China 25 billion, Malaysia deficit 4.5, Singapore 1.1, Taiwan 8.9, Thailand 4.8. All of these are deficits. India 1.8, Japan 60 billion. I'm going out of business. You've given away the store. Something's got to change around this town so we'll understand about Middle America. Here the crowd that came to town to bolster Middle America are decimating Middle America. So this is about adamant and sincerity. I want you to know here and now that we're not leveling the playing field. The playing field is not by the same rules, and we use you as my witness. Why are you trying to get a better agreement with Japan? Of course, you couldn't get financial services. They say the president wants to lead. You couldn't get it when you went there at Marrakech in April. The president went to the G7 conference to lead, as he says, in June. And when he mentioned financial services and an economic agreement, said we go to the next room. Thank you all the same, Mr. Ray. He's not leading. We can't lead with a $130 billion deficit. In fact, Business Magazine says Japan is leaving us in the dust. We're not leaders, we're followers. But how can you play by the same rules when you got to get a separate agreement with Japan on account of Keiretsu, on account of Germany with its cartels? That inner workings are not changed a bit by your GATT. Excuse me, the time is going to get me to answer.
It's always a challenge for me. No, first of all, the longer I'm in this job, I'm also learning by hard experience, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say that if everything you said was correct, and I don't agree with all of it, as you know, but even if it was, you should be the first one working with me to say, let's change it. This changes it. Well, let me.
What's incorrect, by the way?
If I might. Let's take this and reach this agreement and play by the same rules and level the playing field. And let me just say what we were able to accomplish with the President's leadership with Japan this last weekend is a step in the right direction. Did we solve all our problems with Japan? No, sir, we did not. Did we make a beginning? Yes, we did. And we'll have to continue to work at that on a constant basis. Now, let me just make 2 or 3 points in answer to
you're eliminating me from the playing field. You're not eliminating me from the playing field with that WTO. Go right ahead, and then I'll recognize Senator Bro.
I want you on the playing field, Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
I want you on my team. First of all, in terms of manufacturing jobs, in the last 13 months in a row, manufacturing production in this country has increased. In the last 11 months in a row, manufacturing jobs have increased each month.
How about the truth of that statement? Will you get the votes on the truth of that statement? You and I pledge. I can show you where manufacturing jobs have decreased since the Clinton administration has been in.
Sir.
And I can show you also that over the past 10 years, we've gone from 26.3% of our GNP to 16.6%, a diminution and loss of a manufacturing backbone.
But our production continues to rise, including our employment.
Wait a minute, let's talk about manufacturing jobs. Come on, don't double talk me.
Jobs are going up in the last 11 months in manufacturing. 4.4 million new jobs in our economy in the last 19 months. 90-some-odd%, about 97% in the private sector, not in the public sector, only 3% in the public sector, which I think is a tribute to the Congress and this President working together for economic change in the country on a bipartisan basis, and it has to continue. But let me make a couple of other comments on what you just talked about. One on dispute settlement. Let me answer directly because you made a very important point there. No, we can't block rulings anymore. You're right. It's the Congress who asked us to come back with a dispute settlement mechanism that worked without blocking. Now, let me make a second point. We have won over 80% of the time when we've brought cases in Geneva, and when we've been on the defense, we've won 55% of the time. We've been the most successful country in the world in the GATT for 47 years in the old dispute settlement mechanism. But you know what happened? When we would win, the Europeans or others would block those rulings. It frustrated us, especially the agricultural community, and we don't want that to happen again. Mr. Chairman, we live by our international understandings. We don't violate them. Others, unfortunately, have in the past. I hope it doesn't happen in the future. But if it does, we need to have some arbitration mechanism, and that's all this is, by the way. One of the most interesting comments by someone who's opposed to this treaty is that there's some sort of secret panel out there of judges trying to control the United States of America. These are arbitration panels, and we can veto any member of the panel at any time. And frankly, Mr. Chairman,
You just said you couldn't block the decision.
but we can't block, we don't want to block the decision because we
If you
win.
can't agree, you know the system. If you can't agree on the panel, the director appoints them. Salinas from Mexico. Woo!
Well, I would say that President Salinas in our NAFTA agreement, since we increased our exports by 19% over the
I'll
last 7
debate that
months.
with you. Let's go to Senator Bro. Yeah, you next. Then Senator Packard.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I do want to start off by saying that in a very difficult position, that I think you are doing a terrific job in this administration. I think you are to be personally commended for the good work with the Japanese agreement. As one who has argued and debated with them on opening up some of their trading opportunities for over 20 years, I think that the work that you did on the agreement is very positive, and it was not accomplished without a great deal of difficult work. I'm pleased that CAFE standards and the GATT dispute settlement turned out as well as it did. I know that your office was very involved in that, and I think that those are both very positive accomplishments, and I congratulate you for them. I think that the theory that some have utilized with regard to arguments against GATT can be summarized by saying, even if we have a level playing field, we can't compete because other countries have much lower wages. And that even with a level playing field, they're going to beat our brains out because you can hire 47 Vietnamese for the price of one American. Or as Sir Goldsmith points out, 47 Vietnamese for the price of one Frenchman. And you're never going to be able to compete no matter how level the playing field is. I disagree with that. I think that if you do get a level playing field, which the GATT hopefully brings about, the next question is what type of team you put on that field. And that's always going to be the question. The productivity of the American worker, the determination of the American worker, the ability to be aggressive in an international community is what we have to as a nation concentrate on. The level playing field without a good team to put on that field is never going to accomplish what our goals are. So I think that if we can get a GATT agreement, the next thing that we as a nation have to concentrate on is improving the team we put on that field through education, through job training, through incentives economically to help them be the very best that they can be. And then put that team on a level playing field, and I think we'll compete against any country because wages is just one part of the competition equation. Let me ask some more specific questions. Sir Goldsmith, in his testimony to follow yours, getting back to this unemployment question, says following that the losers on the international GATT agreement would be those people who become unemployed as a result of production being moved to low-cost areas. I'd like you to address that. I think his theory is that if you knock down the trade barriers, all the manufacturing and all the jobs are going to go to the places where you can hire 47 Vietnamese for the price of one American. And what we're going to suffer is unemployment because everything's going to be manufactured somewhere else. I'd like you to comment on that statement.
Well, the historic evidence, of course, is to the contrary. There is little and probably no evidence that any country in history ever increased its wealth by closing its borders. 15th century China would be one example. The Soviet Union beginning in 1917 collapsing internally because they closed their borders to trade in the outside world and fell apart. The United States in the 1930s, Latin America in the 1970s. That's point one. So the evidence is just the opposite. Number two, the invocation after the Second World War, the World Bank, IMF, the GATT arrangements, issued the greatest expansion and growth of any economy here in the United States, of any country in the history of humankind. And that's because we began to engage in a world economy where we built on our strengths and not on our weaknesses. Number three, it is not just by chance that the Indians or the Pakistanis close their market to our textiles and our apparel. There's a reason for that, because they realize they can't compete. Now, we're working very hard to open up their economies. Something interesting is happening in our textile and apparel industry. Since 1991, we have exported more than we have imported. The increase in our exports in just 1993-94 in textiles and apparel And exports have been 7.58% increase. Imports have only increased 4.45%.
And didn't every country that we probably exporting to have a lower wage base than our?
They have a lower wage base, and but they're less productive. Productivity is not just wages, as you know, Senator Breaux. It's much more than that. It's infrastructure, it's the communications, it's availability of transportation. It has to do with training. It has to do with education. Now,
it's design, it's creation.
It's design, it's creation. It's all those things. That's why our exports to Mexico have increased so rapidly in the last 7 months by 19%. We literally are out competing businesses that use workers, of course, at much lower wages. That's been the evidence. The evidence is just the opposite from what others have suggested.
Let me ask another question the chairman raised, which I think is a very legitimate one. It's the question of the fact that if we have a World Trade Organization somehow running the trade rules and regulations, they're the umpire, they're the referee. If the group that serves as the referee is 120 nations or what have you, the United States has one vote. I mean, are we not giving up our legitimate interests? I mean, you know, it always disturbs me in international meetings when countries that are the size of this building have the same equal vote as the United States. I'm not saying anything derogatory against them because of their size, but to give them in these international organizations the same weight as the United States or any other developed country seems very unfair. Could you comment on that?
I share your concerns. I share the chairman's concerns. We've talked about this. I think we've all talked about it. Number one, we've operated for 47 years in an organization that operated by majority rule, but de facto they operated by consensus. Now that's part of the Article 9 that operates by consensus. The chairman's right. There are times you can have votes, but no substantive right or obligation in the United States can be altered or changed without our consent. Clearly, every country has that right, by the way, not just the United States of America. So those are 2 points I think we have to remember as we look at this organization. But let me say, number 3, there is something in this implementing legislation that we should not forget. We have agreed with Congress, Republicans and Democrats, that every 5 years, this Congress, House and Senate, can take up the question of whether we should remain in the WTO and vote it up or down and send it to whoever the President of the United States is 10 years from now. 5 years from now, I expect this President will still be here. And so this is something that protects everyone here who has some concerns. And look, the concerns are legitimate. This is not a perfect agreement. At least I'll never be able to come back to you with a perfect agreement. Maybe there's some USTR who will come after me with one, but I certainly can't. But it's so much better than where we are today, and it's critical to get this done. If we're going to continue this expansion that we're in, and that we're beginning to get a recovery in Europe and Japan as well. It is not just by chance that the stock market dropped precipitously yesterday. There were rumors all over this town about what might or might not happen in the other body. I believe it's critical to create a psychological confidence, not only in this country, but around the world. We're going to go forward because we recognize that globalization, interdependence, playing by the same rules is so critical.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Packwood.
Always by the argument that per se, ipso facto, if you reduce employment, that's a step in the wrong direction. If we had that view about agriculture, we'd still be employing half of the people in this country producing food. We take it as a step of progress that from 1900 to 2000, we've gone from about half the country on the farm to 2%, and we still produce more than we had, and we hold that up as a hallmark of success. And yet, if at the same time General Motors used to need 10 people to produce a car and can now do it with 2 people, somehow that is not success. And I don't understand the difference. Everybody gets more productive. But I want to ask you a specific question in relation to the chairman's question about manufacturing, and first the United States and then generically. As I recall the figures, our manufacturing base, not percent of gross national product, but base, hasn't changed much. The new jobs are coming, by and large, in non-manufacturing sectors. Therefore, the GNP is getting bigger, and as manufacturing is relatively static, and I'm not using that in a derogatory term, it becomes a smaller percent of the whole, but the whole is growing, and manufacturing is not going down. Is that roughly the same trend in most of the major industrialized countries, that their growth sector is in services, their growth sector is elsewhere, and in manufacturing it pretty much mirrors ours.
That's exactly right. Frankly, one of the things that's interesting in which we are not able to calculate, and I wish we had the ability to do so, as manufacturing jobs have gone down, yet productivity has gone up, as you suggest, and that's exactly the case, Senator. There are many more jobs associated with each job in manufacturing, whether creating, design, computer software, all kinds of allied jobs that we don't count in terms of manufacturing, the service industries, but make that worker in the plant that much more productive. Let me make one comment because I think it fits right into this, and it's something the chairman said earlier. I was in New Haven, Connecticut. I went out to a plant called Firelight. 5 years ago, Firelight had 5% of their sales. They were about a $50 million company then. They're $120 million today. They're not a Fortune 500 company. 5% of their sales were in foreign sales, overseas. Today, it's 50%. Almost all of their growth has come in foreign sales. They're one of the world's leaders technologically. I walked over to a fax machine where they were getting orders from around the world, Malaysia, Indonesia. I just walked over there and saw them coming in to see where they were coming in from. I walked outside and there was a sign out front, Senator, which is a welcome sign to Republicans and Democrats and everyone in this country. Help wanted. We haven't seen that in this country in the last number of years, and it's something that ought to do our hearts good. But it's help wanted because we're competing and winning in a world economy which is growing. And I have never been so struck by a clear example of what you're talking about and what we're talking about, trying to work together on a bipartisan basis to use the Uruguay round to continue to grow these signs across the country, help wanted.
Next question, dispute settlement. Of necessity, the Finance Committee has the largest burden in these trade agreements because of our jurisdiction over trade. I can vouch for the fact that if there was any single thing we pushed you on, it was on dispute resolution because we were mad about being blocked. We were winning, if you want to call it a judgment, we were winning the judgments, but we couldn't enforce them. And time and again, when you would come to appear before us, we would get back to that issue about are you getting some method of enforcement? Now, let me ask you if this is a correct assessment. Indeed, any dispute settlement that goes against us cannot compel us to change our laws. If we choose not to comply with it, they can take retaliatory action against us, as we can in the opposite situation. But this is something that we have not been trying to avoid. It's something we've been striving for.
That's exactly right. The now famous Marine Mammal Protection Act, the tuna dolphin case, in which we did not prevail in Geneva, if we decide, in which I think this Congress will, not to change our law, will cost us the grand total in trade of $250,000. That's on a trade base of $1.7 trillion. That is what happens. So I think this has been it's a canard. It's been vastly overstated. We're the big winners with this dispute settlement mechanism. The Finance Committee of this body has pushed and shoved, and you're right, myself, Ambassador Hills before me, before that Ambassador Yider, to come back with this mechanism. And now you have Republicans and Democrats agreeing on it. It's in the best interest of the country.
We don't grow a lot of soybeans in Oregon, but I don't know how long I heard about that soybean case, and we won it, and we won it, and we won it, and we could not enforce it, and they would not comply. And this was big. This wasn't marine mammal. This was big bucks, and we could not enforce it.
And of course, we just won two cases, the cafe case and the gas guzzler tax case were just upheld due to the good work and fine work of some lawyers in our office with help from a lot of other folks in both administrations, frankly, Senator, and I think that should give all of us confidence that our laws are properly done by this Congress and working with the administration, Republican or Democrat, and will be upheld by these panels when challenged.
Next question. You have, in the GATT agreement, a 3-year time frame for harmonizing rules of origin. Why, in terms of implementing this agreement, was it necessary for you to put in a shorter time frame to change the rules of origin?
One of the things that we've all tried to work on is to make sure our industries are kept competitive as well as productive. We're the only country in the world who had a cutting, quote-unquote, rule of origin, if that's, I'm sure you're referring to, versus an assembly rule of origin. That made no sense, frankly, Senator, from anyone's point of view. It was allowing, frankly, the Chinese to send apparel and textiles into this country through Hong Kong and use their quotas because of a bare addition to the value of the goods by the cutting in Hong Kong versus the assembly which was being done in China. There are other examples of that. That one comes to mind. By the way, as a footnote, something we are very interested in, we believe now imports of textiles and apparel from China for the first time in, I guess, 17 years will be down and down by almost 5%, because we have a textile ambassador who did a marvelous job after we invoked sanctions, drawing an agreement with China which brought them down to zero growth. Now they're less than zero growth this year. But let me go back. So the rule of origin is something this administration supported with many members of Congress in both sides of the aisle. Senator Breaux, I think, introduced it over here. Representative Cardin on the House side, because it harmonized us with the rest of the world. It addressed the problem we were facing that was so difficult. But no one need worry. We still have to go through the Treasury Department and write the regulations under the rules. Senator Breaux has insisted on an open process. This administration will adhere to that. We also have international obligations we'll adhere to. Of course, we have to relook at quotas. The fact is, though, we must change the rule of origin if we're going to remain competitive. It's something that was, frankly, not fair to our textile and apparel industry the way we were doing it, and I believe it's important that we did it in the way we have in this agreement.
Thank you, Senator Rockefeller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, I want to congratulate you for what you've done, partly because I've seen you at work. I think you have the hardest job in the United States government, other than the one that was described in the Washington Post this morning as Andrew Friendly, who is with the president all the time. But I'm going, well, he's his gopher, and he's got to keep the president on time, and that's something which is very hard to do for any mortal. But I'm just looking at a list here of sections that I had a particular interest in the GATT. And then I took a trip over to Geneva. I guess I left just the day you arrived, but you know, very, very concerned about in a state like West Virginia, which is so dependent upon what happens in agreements like GATT, where we've lost more than 10% of our population in each of the last 2 decades. So you can understand my sensitivity about job loss and the possibilities, and that's why I think that my strong support for GATT says something. We worked hard on intellectual property, Section 337. That was resolved in a way which is entirely satisfactory to us, and you've made some mention of that this morning. Captive production is enormously important to a state like West Virginia. That was resolved entirely satisfactorily for us. Duty absorption in sunset matters, circumventions and diversion, the whole question of countries taking products through other countries and into this country, that was solved. I mean, all these were hot-button issues with great residue and anger attached to each of them, but that was done well. Injury determination, causation, the so-called a cause is versus the cause, and that was done, settled, to the advantage of fairness in our country and my state. Related party importers are excluded if they oppose petitions. That was complicated, important, and resolved satisfactory. Subsidies, sunset, negligible imports, non-market economies. Remember, that was just desperately hot button stuff. But that was left out. That was done, negotiated by you. I don't know how you did it, but you got that out. Short supply of just enormous importance to the steel industry and others in my state. That was resolved to the satisfaction. That was killed. And all of these things were really quite extraordinary works on your part, many all-night negotiating sessions and the rest of it. And I'm just thinking that, as you say, we are changing. One of the things that I've been kind of amazed by is people don't pay much attention to how much the Japanese themselves are changing. And one of the very first things that was actually sort of slipped into the GATT, almost unbeknownst to the world, was the fact that that rice would be imported into their country. And that was one of the earliest, I think, areas that was just kind of put in there, and it was very skillfully done. That might have been under, I think that was under the previous administration. It doesn't make any difference. It was done, and it was very effective. Our distinguished chairman is talking about job loss. We've had a lot of job loss in West Virginia, and he's worried about job loss in this country. We've seen every day in the headlines companies reducing. That's happening in Japan, too. I can remember I used to go there a couple times a year, and I remember going to an undisclosed camera maker, and in their Keiretsu system, they have, as you know, a system of suppliers, and it's built on long tradition and long loyalty. And I remember going to sort of a bottom-end supplier where the lenses were just the beginning of the grinding took place, and it was not modern. It was very old, and the wages weren't as good, and it was not a very pretty place, but it had a relationship with this camera company for a long time. And I went in, I talked with the manager, and then we went upstairs, and I said, "What's your future?" He said, "My future is zero, because they're going to take everything I'm doing in this factory, and they're going to do it in Southeast Asia." So Japan's changing. Their unemployment's going up. Their lifetime employment situation is beginning to break down. The whole Keiretsu system itself, the traditional suppliers, is now being challenged and changed. So that I want to praise you for the work you've done. I don't think it is perfect. You didn't come up properly on, in my judgment, on startup variable costs, fair comparison. But as you say, you can't win them all. And on my list, there were 13 things that I really cared about for a state which had lost 10% of its population for each of the last 2 decades. And you came up with a winning hit on 11 of those 13. And as a representative of the state of West Virginia, I don't know how I can do anything but support, as I do, what you have done in GATT. So I want to commend you for that, and I want to ask you to repeat, because this is brought up constantly, and I'm actually sort of saying this not so much for the members of the committee, but those people who might be listening to this or watching this hearing. When this question of American sovereignty is brought up, as it is time and time and time and time again, you've answered that very, very clearly, but I'd like to hear you answer it once again.
Thank you, Senator. When I attempted to play baseball,
you did a very good job, and I'd like to have you read the same section because I want people to hear it.
I never in any series went 11 for 13, so I appreciate that. I have at 55 years old accomplished something I never did at 18 years old. Let me start with number 1. The Section 102 of the bill makes it very clear that, quote, no provision of any Uruguay Round agreement, nor the application of any such provision to any person or circumstance that is inconsistent with any law of the United States shall have effect. That's first. Second, no substantive right or obligation of the United States of America can be altered or changed without our consent under this agreement. Number 3, we've put in this law that every 5 years the Congress of the United States can review the WTO and its workings, and by a vote of each body, a majority vote of each body, could in fact pass legislation to withdraw from this organization. Number 4, no ruling by a dispute settlement panel will force either the Congress of the United States, any state legislature, any city council, anybody in this country to change any law. That's up to us. I can't imagine how we could have protected our sovereignty more than we have under this agreement. Let me say one other thing. Chairman and I disagree to some extent on this, but to put in the first sentence of Article 9 of this agreement that this organization operates by consensus, and the fact they can't change any substantive right or obligation of our country, and the fact they can't change any law, and the fact we can maintain more stringent standards in environmental and conservation matters concerning human, animal, or plant life, should give every American the confidence not only that we've protected our sovereignty, it's much more protected the day that we implement it here in this country and it goes into effect than it has been for 47 years in Geneva. Yet, those agreements, along with IMF and World Bank at the end of the Second World War, ushered in the greatest expansion of an economy in the history of humankind. So, Senator, 1, I appreciate your overly kind remarks. Number 2, and your support for this. Number 3, I think you're right. Let me make one more comment. I'm sorry, but it raised one other issue that's critical. We've got to preserve our trade laws, and that's what you're talking about. We didn't give those up, whether it's Section 301, Title 7, or our anti-dumping laws. We must preserve them. This country should never give up its right or obligation to enforce its trade laws to make sure that we're all playing by the same rules. We have just operated under that, as you know, this weekend with Japan. We have made some strides forward. As I said, we didn't solve all our problems with Japan this weekend. That's going to be a long-term concern. But this administration is going to work with both sides of the aisle. We're going to enforce our trade laws. We're going to address these problems. We've done it with Title 7. We've done it with Special 301. We've done it with China. We've done it with Japan. We've done it with Europe. And we'll continue to do it because it's in the best interest of American workers.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, thank you, Senator Danforth.
Mr. Ambassador, the Uruguay round has been described as the largest worldwide tax cut in history. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Could you very briefly tell us what that means?
By lowering tariffs around the globe by an average of 40%, and as you know so well, Senator, given your long history in trade, tariffs in other countries around the world, except for maybe Singapore and Hong Kong, are much higher than ours. We are cutting the price of that consumers are going to have to pay in those countries for goods that are exported into those countries. Therefore, it acts as a tax cut. It's $754 billion over the next 10 years, $36 billion to American consumers. So it acts as a major and significant tax cut.
So American consumers will be paying $36 billion less in federal taxes as a result
Not
of
in
this?
federal taxes, cost of goods. It acts as a tax cut because of paying less for the goods. Now, what's interesting, because of the economic stimulus this will create, every study has shown we'll collect about $3 in federal revenue for every dollar in our tariff cuts. So we've got the best of all worlds. Lower prices for consumers, or a tax cut for consumers, more money for the federal treasury, and more exports going overseas. I think that's a good deal by anyone's estimate.
A lot of emphasis has been placed on how are we going to pay for this with respect to the budget. But I take it what you've said is that any dynamic analysis of what this will do for the federal budget means that it will improve the situation with respect to the deficit rather than make matters worse.
Absolutely. As you know, under the 1990 budget agreement, we have a static model, not a dynamic model. Therefore, anytime you, in this case, lower tariffs, you must find the money to pay for it. I'd like to point out in the very delicately negotiated pay-go agreement between the administration and the Congress, both sides, both parties, 65% of the payment, so to speak, for the tariff cuts, and again, this is based on a static model, are in cuts, not in any kind of revenue raises. 35% are in compliance or timing devices. I think it was a delicately reached agreement, done very well by both administration and this Congress, by Republicans and Democrats, in addressing a very difficult problem, which is how do you use a static model when you're talking about a dynamic agreement?
Now, the tariffs by other countries on exports from the United States to those countries will be cut by over a third. What does this mean for U.S. employment?
Growth, higher wages, higher standard of living. We'll grow more high-skilled jobs. We have been frustrated continually over the years by tariff and non-tariff barriers, whether it's agriculture or our manufacturing sector, as we're the most productive and competitive country in the world now today by everyone's estimate, including international organizations. This is in our interest to get these barriers down to get our goods in.
You don't think this is going to be a sucking sound? Do you think this will create more jobs in the United States?
Absolutely.
Some say that it would create between 300 and 700,000 new jobs by the year 2004. Is that pretty close to the mark, you think?
Well, that has been the consensus estimate. What's interesting, that is a static model. They don't take into account intellectual property rights protection, the services agreement, or the agriculture agreement. It's fascinating. All we're talking about is the manufacturing sector alone, so of course it'll be higher than that. Others have estimated higher, but that is a reasonable and conservative estimate.
Now, if we were to delay implementation of GATT for, say, 6 months, would that have a negative effect on the United States?
Yes, sir. The Treasury Department has done a study, and Secretary Benson has indicated it would cost us over 10 years $70 billion in economic growth.
You said you played tennis with the chairman. I take it you don't mind playing a little softball with me?
No, I always lost it. I enjoy this, and I enjoyed playing. The chairman always beat me, though, Senator.
How about agriculture, Mr. Ambassador? Of course, we wanted more reduction in subsidies of agriculture by the rest of the world. That's been a long-standing problem of the United States, hasn't it? Foreign agricultural subsidies.
It's been frustrating when you're as competitive as our agricultural sector. What you want to do is open markets. The Europeans have been our greatest competitor and the greatest subsidizer. They have had 20%. They have to cut their internal supports by 20%. We don't have to cut it all. They have to cut their external or export subsidies by 21% over 6 years, as we do. We have backloaded, by the way, that agreement under what we call Blair House 2, which helps our agricultural industry. And the fact is, this will be extremely helpful. Let me just indicate, just yesterday, almost every commodity group in the United States came out for the Uruguay Round Agreement.
I've got my yellow light on, so let me just ask you one question. There's been a lot in the press within the last few days on the pioneer preference issue. This is really not a trade issue, but it's emerged as a way of paying for this agreement, and various telephone companies have taken out full-page ads in the Washington Post attacking it. My understanding was that there was a competition for licensing of this PCS system, and that the winner of the competition was to get a pioneer preference. I mean, that was the reward.
Exactly.
However, after the fact, people started criticizing that. So then it was worked out with the winners. Well, instead of getting the free license, you'll have to pay for it. Substantial amounts of money you'll have to pay. Now that in turn is being criticized. But could you give us a little explanation of this? Because, I mean, my own view is that the telephone companies, having lost the contest, but having won in the telecommunications legislation, they're now feeling their oats again, desirous of having Congress jump through their hoops again. But could you explain this whole thing? Is this some sort of unfair thing or rip-off that we're asked to be part of?
Just the opposite. This is in the best interest of the American taxpayer. You are absolutely correct. The Pioneer Preference Program was developed in the prior administration, but I think correctly so, to enhance innovation and to induce companies who won these to take big risks, spend millions and millions of dollars in new technology in hopes that we can continue to be the world's leader in that area. 3 companies won that. One of the companies that is complaining most did not win. I'm not criticizing, they did not win. These licenses were supposed to be for free at that point. There was a lawsuit, and there was concern about that lawsuit. In addition, in the other body, on a bipartisan basis, Mr. Moorhead, Chairman Dingell, indicated that it might be helpful if these companies who won paid for this spectrum or channels rather than getting them for free. Now, there are different estimates as how much will be paid. The formula is very complicated. OMB estimates they'll pay up to $1.1 to $1.2 billion. CBO estimates about $540 or $550 million. But whatever estimate you want to come up with, we're paying for something now that was free. Those who are complaining now, the company complaining now, frankly, was a company that lost, tried to buy a company that won and was unable to do so, and now number 3, in order to compete in their own area of the country for another valuable license on the Personal Communication System license, which you're very familiar with, Mr. Chairman, Senator, what they have done, and Mr. Chairman, you're familiar with this all, they have said they want to have these companies pay more because they know they only have one chance at a license there, and they're going to have to pay more for spectrum. Frankly, the Congress has made a decision everyone ought to pay for spectrum or channels. That's the only fair way to do it. Now these Pioneer Preference companies, or companies which have Pioneer Preference licenses, will pay. I think that's fair. I think what's been done here is in the best interest of the U.S. taxpayer and, frankly, in the best interest of continuing this innovation in the communications area.
Very good. Thank you. Senator Presley.
Ambassador Cantor, does the administration support Alice Rivlin's letter of August 8, 1994, wherein she stated that regarding the budget waiver, we do not believe it is necessary to sacrifice budget discipline to pass GATT or in the Congress? And in fact, it appears that the administration is backing away from her letter. I was one of 18 senators who wrote to her, and she wrote a letter back on August 8th saying, we fear that if Congress were to reverse the progress that has been made over these last years and so forth. But it seemed that when the enabling legislation appeared last week, it included just $12 billion in offsets. And then somebody over there, number 2 or somebody said, well, we expect this to yield so much in the future. That may be speculation, but that's not the law. Do you stand by the August 8th letter of Alice Rivlin? And let me say that I think the members who wrote that letter consider that budget waiver a very serious business.
The August 8th letter, of course, was referring to the first 5 years under PAYGO, not the 10 years. As you know, each body has a different rule. The House has a 5-year rule. The Senate has a 10-year rule. Ms. Rivlin's letter is quite clear. What we're talking about is paying for the first 5 years, and we'll seek a budget waiver over here for the second 5 years. And the administration position has been absolutely, frankly, Senator, clear, precise, and has not been altered since day one of this discussion.
But the total offsets scored by CBO add up to $7.8 billion from 95 to 99, which is $1.6 billion short of financing GATT over the first 5 years.
No, sir, that's not true. If you take the PAYGO savings and other savings as well, we have met, in fact, Republicans and Democrats agree on both sides, Ways and Means and Finance Committee, 35-3 vote in Ways and Means, 19-0 in Finance Committee. We have met our obligations in the first 5 years of PAYGO.
I have this from the Senate Budget Committee that disagrees. I think we'll have to get something in writing Can I give you these figures from the Senate Budget Committee? Because I want to distribute a letter to the senators who wrote that letter, because I feel that the administration is backing away from her August 8th letter.
In fact, Senator, I will read you if you would like, or we can put it in the record, but I'd be glad to answer. Obviously, we would respond directly and completely to any inquiry you have. I have in front of me the numbers of areas which add up to the amount of money needed for the first 5 years to offset the static concept under the 1990 budget agreement known as PAYGO.
Okay, let me pursue this by giving you 2 or 3 written questions, and
sure,
you can respond to them.
And we'd be happy to respond.
Let me go on to the method of financing that. I must say that the Washington Post is getting rich from full-page ads on this issue, if not from their subsidiary. But in any event, this business of pioneer preference and so forth, and paying for these by tell me, why did the administration turn to the pioneers who developed PCS for these funds?
Because it was in the best interest of the U.S. taxpayer. The fact is that given the lawsuit and the lack of certainty, these companies believed, and so did a bipartisan members, Republicans and Democrats, that they should pay for these licenses, even though they received them, as you know, Senator, so well, on a basis they would not pay. It will create from $540 million to over $1 billion worth of revenue to the federal government. I think that's substantial in the best interest of the American public.
Okay, now as I understand the FCC's Pioneer Preference Program, innovators of new technologies, the pioneers would be rewarded by assurances of receiving licenses to deploy the technologies they had developed. Because a spectrum is a scarce resource, the promise of a license was designed to stimulate investment in the development of new telecommunications technologies. This is what the FCC determined the pioneers have done. Last year, Congress gave the FCC the authority to use auctions to grant spectrum licenses. Initially, the FCC determined that because the pioneers would not participate in the auctions, they would not have to pay for the licenses. Recently, the FCC determined the pioneers would have to pay. Now, I might ask for your comment on that, and I'd like to know what discussions you've had with Reed Hunt about the wisdom of addressing this issue in the context of GATT.
One, I've never discussed that with Mr. Hunt at all. Number two, this started in Chairman Dingell's committee with the support of Mr. Moorhead. Number three, the FCC attempted to alter their policy, as you know, and didn't have the legislative authority, and that was the genesis of this whole debate. All we've done here is say, if we're going to, of course, collect revenue we weren't going to collect for the American taxpayer, it should be used, and I think there was agreement on both sides of the aisle to offset the cut in tariffs as a result of the Uruguay round, which of course creates on a dynamic model $3 for every $1 in tariff cuts. We can't count that under the 1990 budget agreement, as you know so well.
Okay, now I understand the FCC's proposals would have required the pioneers to pay 90% of the market value of the licenses. Some analysts predict that the 3 pioneers license would be worth $2 billion. The GATT bill requires the pioneers to pay 85%. This does not sound like much of a difference, although I understand it's figured on a somewhat different formula. The bill guarantees the government at least $400 million. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the pioneers would pay $530 million. How did the administration decide how much it would settle for?
We didn't decide how much we would settle for. We estimated based upon the formula developed in the Congress in our CBO over $1 billion. I mean, our OMB over $1 billion. CBO was a lower estimate. Of course, in the PAYGO, we're going with the lower estimate as we are bound to do. So we didn't determine anything. It was a formula that was used to make that determination.
Okay. I'll submit a couple of additional written questions to you on that. I have one final question. That is that at this very moment, there are some New England senators conspiring to pass a Northeast Dairy Compact, which would establish a dairy cartel for the New England states, where those states could significantly raise subsidies for milk production and keep fluid milk out from other parts of the country. This would be a cartel. It's led by some great Democratic senators from the Northeast. I believe the compact will be viewed as an unfair trade barrier by dairy exporting countries. It goes opposite the goals of GATT, and it's been defined as an agreement of GATT. I told your staff I was going to ask you this question yesterday. Is that a violation of GATT?
Well, it may even be of some concern in terms of the Interstate Commerce Clause as well as GATT. I believe that I've not seen the documents or the so-called compact or understanding. We've not been able to review it. We just heard about it when you raised it with our staff. We would have great concerns about that, Senator.
Yes, I think it would clearly be a violation of GATT. And I have some additional questions on that. And I see the red light is on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator, very much.
Thank you very much,
Appreciate it.
Mr. Ambassador. There's a vote pending at this moment, so I must advise my colleagues here. I have a very simple question. The treaty before us is the result of discussions and negotiations that began in 1986. The committee has had this treaty for less than 10 days. Why the big rush?
After 8 years and literally hundreds of hearings, thousands of pages of testimony, maybe thousands of meetings with the staff, I have frankly participated in 23 hearings in the Congress, Senate, and House just in the last year alone, not to speak of what happened last year in 1993, Senator. We have come to a point where the world, 123 nations, have finally agreed after 8 long, arduous years marked by pain and blood and sweat and tears, that we need this agreement in order to enhance global growth and to play by the same rules and to make sure we grow jobs not only in our country but around the world. Delay would cost us $70 billion. That was a study done by Secretary Benson's Treasury Department. That is something we don't want, $70 billion in economic growth. It would cause even more economic harm around the world. Let me just say psychologically, at a time when Europe is just beginning to recover and Japan is just beginning to recover and where others are beginning to grow so fast in Latin America and Asia, and when our expansion is so impressive and continuing, this is not the time to take an agreement that has been thoroughly discussed, thoroughly vetted, completely understood, I think, by just about everyone, and stop it now. It would be not helpful to our expansion, to our growth, to global growth, and to the rest of our allies.
An additional month and a half would make that big a difference?
Senator, if we wait and don't implement the Uruguay round by 1/1/95, what we'll be doing is running the risk that others won't ratify, and we're talking about more than a month and a half. Let me explain. Every economic, foreign, or trade minister I talk to by phone or in person, every head of state I get to talk to, this is also verified by the President and Secretary Benson, the first question they ask is, when is the United States of America going to ratify the Uruguay Round Agreement? They are waiting for us. They look to us for leadership with the largest trading nation in the world. 3 administrations have supported this. The President re-engaged these talks in January '93, said in 10.5 months we're going to finish, and we did. It would be difficult to see these other countries moving forward without the United States moving forward first. And I believe we have an obligation to continue that leadership. It's in our interest to do so in the interest of our workers.
Of the 123 countries, how many have ratified the agreement?
I'm going to have to, I will give you a precise number for the record, Senator. It's around 40 some odd now, but the major economic powers, European Union, Japan, and others are waiting, and they're waiting for the United States, and you can't blame them. If we're not going to ratify this, then they're going to have difficult problems within their own processes as well, and I think it is incumbent upon us to move forward on a bipartisan basis.
My last question on a matter of clarification. You indicated that on the matter of sovereignty, any state or this nation can pass laws that are much stricter than the rest of the world, zero tolerance on carcinogens, as you pointed out.
Yes, sir.
What if this Congress adopted a law, and it's in the realm of possibility, that the United States will not accept products of child labor?
The discussion of internationally recognized labor standards, of which that is one, as you're well aware, Senator, has been a discussion that's been going on since 1919, starting with the Treaty of Versailles. 47 years ago, when the old ITO, International Trade Organization, the intersection of trade and internationally recognized labor rights was going to be implemented, but of course the ITO never went into existence. In 1953, the Eisenhower administration advocated the intersection of internationally recognized labor rights and trade. That has been sustained by every administration, Democrat and Republican, since then. The United States of America already enforces our GSP law and forbids the use of child or slave labor under that and the violation of labor rights. And so I think that we would have an argument that we were following that pattern. It might be challenged. More important, though, would be the continuation of the discussion which we've now fostered in the Preparatory Committee for the World Trade Organization for the first time in 47 years, that we begin to address internationally recognized labor standards. Child labor, slave labor, freedom of association, right to collectively bargain, and of course conditions of work. That would be critical.
From your response, would that mean that we will have to accept products of child labor and slave labor?
No, sir.
We can stop them at the ports?
No, sir. We already, in our GSP law and other laws, have enforced that, as you know.
I notice my time is up, and I thank you very much, Mr. Nimitz.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Dogan.
Saying, or do you know what your plans are?
Yes, sir. We want to give you and the others, I think,
Well,
a couple others want to still.
Mr. Chairman, let me.
Then we'll have to. We just can't have a second round. We'll just keep
All right,
going.
let me abbreviate my. I want to make a comment to the ambassador, and then ask 3 quick questions, and then I must run and cast this vote. First of all, I think you're the best trade ambassador we've had for many, many years, and I recognize that's not saying much because I didn't think much of the previous 2. So let me go well beyond that to say that I think you are a real bright spot in public service in this town, and that's why I regret so much from time to time when we disagree. I come from a farm state, and I kind of think of the global economy as a giant international economic cow that feeds at one end and is milked at another end. And when I look at things like this, I wonder who's getting fed and who's getting milked. And that's sort of the framework in which I think the chairman and others are trying to figure out how does this affect various parts of our economy and who does it affect in the world in certain ways. And I guess I probably view this in an almost impossibly simplistic way. In a global model, I think that the largest corporate producers in the world want to produce where they can access cheap wages, and they want to sell into markets where consumers have money. I think GATT is a facilitator of those hopes. And in the long term, I fear that disconnects the stream of income from production that has formed the wealth that's available for consumption. In other words, I think it's a model that disconnects 2 important elements. The income stream from production represents the income available for consumption. So we have a philosophical, I guess, disagreement about how this works. The access to established markets, because those markets were established in a way that required fights over living standards, wages, child labor laws, and so on, the access to that, I think, ought to impose some responsibilities. And my sense is that we are going through a period where we talk about responsibilities of child labor and so on, but the fact is we're going to be competing with 1 American versus 80 Chinese, 1 American versus 40 Indians, 1 American versus 20 Filipinos in terms of comparable income. And I think that's very difficult to compete with under these circumstances. I'd like to ask 3 questions, given that as a prelude. Lester Thoreau sat where you sat one day, and he said, these type of agreements, he was talking about NAFTA and GATT, will inevitably mean lower income for low-skilled or low-wage workers in the U.S. Lower income for low-skilled U.S. workers. What % of the workers in the U.S. are classified as low-skilled? 70%. Do you disagree with that?
Of course I disagree with that.
Why
the whole
has
history of our expansion to the Second World War is exactly the opposite of that, and so I disagree with. I guess I should do that with some trepidation. I am not an economist. No one's ever accused me of being as bright as Mr. Thoreau, but I just think he's wrong. There's no evidence to support that.
Does this agreement not pit unskilled American workers into an arena with other unskilled workers who make 1/10 or 1/40th the wage? And isn't it almost inevitable that one would think the result will be a depressing of the wages of those with lesser skills, even in industrialized countries?
We have no difference. We come to a different conclusion. This is not a theological debate at all. I'm not theological or philosophical. Let me just answer your question, because and I'll do it very quickly.
Sure.
That's the situation now. People are protecting their markets, locking out our goods. They won't let us compete. We can outcompete anyone in the world because wages are not the only factor in productivity, as you know so well. We are in a position now to take advantage of a single undertaking where everybody plays by the same rules. And let me tell you what I believe, and the President believes, and many people believe is going to happen. You may not agree with this. We will be shipping high-value added goods made by American workers, raise our skills and our wage rates and our standard of living to countries who will then build their industries and raise standard of living, grow a middle class, and will become our consumers of the future. If we don't do that, and other industrialized nations don't do that, we're going to run out of consumers, going to run out of markets. Technology is going to overtake us. We're going to lose jobs because our markets aren't expanding. In fact, you raise the correct problem, and you and I have talked about this, but we come to opposite conclusions. I believe the evidence is on our side.
And your position, I think, is that we face, I think you would agree, in the United States in the last decade, a real decrease in adjusted income for families. Take away inflation. American families have less income now than a decade ago. Do you agree with that?
It has, without an expansion of exports, which has happened, it would be even worse.
I understand.
That's the difference of opinion.
I understand that point, and you're saying, I'm simply saying the base is American families have lost income in the last decade.
Sure.
And you would say
that's beginning to turn around, as you know.
You would say that that's because barriers prohibit us from producing and selling into other markets. And I would say that at least part of it is because the producers of the world have decided to engage their production elsewhere, and jobs that used to be ours, good manufacturing jobs, have moved elsewhere. So we're looking at the same symptom. The symptom is that we have lost income, and it tends to confirm to me what Lester Thoreau and other economists say, that if you decide our lower skilled workers in America shall compete with all other lower skilled workers and there's no access charge to our marketplace, then we will inevitably suffer lower wages for lower skilled Americans.
Wrong.
And you disagree with that?
Education, training, technology, infrastructure, communication, roads, availability of financing, that's where we stand, and that's our challenge, and that's what we've got to do. And you and I, let me just finish. If you believe you're correct, and if Mr. Thoreau is correct, then we ought to change. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. What we need to do is change, play by the same rules, enforce our trade laws, we'll open markets, and we'll grow our standard of living.
Well, I wanted to ask one additional question, and that is, what is the responsibility for the entry fee to our marketplace? Is it that you don't produce with kids? Is it that you don't produce in prison? Is it that you pay a living wage? I'd like for you, if you could, to give me, and I don't have time now, but give me, what are the entrance requirements? What are the responsibilities?
I can do it real quick. Right. Act with comparability and mutuality of obligation. In other words, if we're going to open our markets to your goods and we're going to sustain your economy, you've got to do the same for ours.
Let me make one final point.
Yes, sir.
You've said change is essential. If I put on a blindfold and listened to the words, not knowing who the speaker was, I couldn't tell one whit of difference between trade policy now versus trade policy in 1982, with the exception of your aggressiveness to deal with trade problems on bilateral basis, and I give you great credit because others wouldn't do that. But I'm saying the general philosophy of GATT is one that has prevailed for 10, 12 years out here, and I can't tell a difference. It might be a difference in tone, but not much difference in substance of where this leads us, and that's why I think this is not change. This instead is probably more of the same. I desperately want to engage more on this issue, but I have about 2 minutes to go to the floor and vote. So thank you
Anytime, I
very much,
appreciate
Mr.
it. Thank you
Ambassador.
for your kind remarks.
Mr. Ambassador, while we are waiting the others to come back, there's so many things to be corrected. I think it was Mark Twain who said that the truth is such a precious thing, it should be used very sparingly. Go right to our leader, President Bill Clinton. He said at the DSCC committee meeting the other night that global trade put downward pressure on wages in the United States, and there's no question about it. We see it happening every day. With respect to the matter of revenue loss, you were correct, and I appreciate you doing that, because the distinguished senator from Missouri said, and I got his exact, the taxpayers will be paying $36 billion less in taxes. And Ambassador Cantor corrected that, said no less in cost to the consumer.
That's correct.
That's correct. You get such a distorted thing about a tax cut. There's no tax cut to this thing. We cut our tariffs, and that's why we got a revenue loss, and that's why it's a budget buster. And incidentally, that's one of the big reasons they put off the vote in the House, I understand, until Friday. The railroad is being slowed, and they're beginning to watch. And they're beginning to understand all those commitments they made about a balanced budget, and here they're being asked to vote to bust the budget, $31 billion. And that's a revenue loss, and there's not any taxes involved, it's the cost. And as the next witness, and that's why we're trying to move along, he's a highly important one. So James Goldsmith said when Nike moved its manufacturing from U.S. to Asia, shoe prices did not drop, profit margins rose. Now, your friend and mine, Evelyn Dubrow, filled up my office. It looked like a rummage sale. I've got skirts, shirts, brassieres, everything. Several of them made in one country, some in India, all in the United States, India and in the United States, Thailand and in the United States, showing that either the same price, the price didn't drop, but the profit increased, or it's even a bigger price on the imported articles. So we'll have a hearing on that to correct the impression around here that they got the biggest tax cut in history. You see, we use this language very liberally. With respect, you would lead the folks to believe on textiles, which I'm intimately involved with. Hard experience again, and you go about the percent of increase. Not so tall. What we're talking about overall. Number one, in 1982, I introduced a textile bill. It was later vetoed by President Reagan. At that particular time in the debate, we showed that the Europeans had a $4 billion deficit in the balance of textile trade, and the United States had a $4 billion deficit in the balance of trade. But for failure of the United States not enforcing its dumping laws, which you're helping some with the rules of origin, I commend you for it. But by the failure of them not to use their dumping laws, our $4 billion is gone to $31 billion deficit in the balance of textile trade. The Europeans have gone down to less than $1 billion. They know how to play the game, enforce the laws. I've been begging for this. And theirs has gone down to less than one. Ours has gone up to $31 billion, a third of our deficit, with automobiles over half, of course, about two-thirds. And what did we have? We have Augie Tantilla. I saw him in the audience earlier. He was with the Commerce Department, and he made the import penetration studies at Commerce. And then a little lady took her, I'm not trying to involve her, but I happen to know, took it to Conference Board and factored these in to the loss of jobs. This was on the Carla Hills. And we found out we were going to lose 1,300,000 jobs. And we tried to get the study and tried to get the study, and even though I got your budget, I couldn't get your study out of your office. It wasn't
Senator,
you.
if I'm Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Ambassador. Now, wait a minute. So we then paid the Wharton School of economics to make a study, and we found also there was going to be 1 million jobs lost. Now, in order to get to NAFTA, you pledged in a letter, your administration, to give us a 15-year phase-out in order to get the NAFTA vote, and when I was talking to everybody over there in Geneva, you didn't even talk to the textile people. You gave them the 10 years, and under that 10-year study, we're going to lose over 1 million textile jobs. So don't use about the percentage, and all of this is going to be happy days for textiles. Stock market. When we announced our opposition and that we were going to hold up on this bill, then the next day the stock market went up 14 points. The reason I raise that is y'all grabbing at all kind of straws trying to intimate that the stock market went down yesterday on account of this GATT debate. My TV, and I heard several programs, was on one, that it was inflation. And yes, that's another subject that I like to work on about the deficit. And we can talk about that because, in a sense, you and I are in pari delicto. You think you're in charge of trade, and I think as chairman I'm in charge of commerce. Actually, the Finance Committee is in charge of commerce, and Secretary Lloyd Benson is in charge of trade. Why? Because as Felix Royalton testified last week before the Finance Committee, we depend on the Japanese for the purchasing of 1/3 of our financial instruments. Yes, we brought the deficit down, but with the Eastern Europeans coming into the capitalistic market, with the Chinese coming in there, there's a greater demand for capital. So the 270 billion rather than 370 billion deficit is noteworthy in one context, but in the sense of capital and the need thereof, we're in still deep trouble. And so you go to bring the pressure. And I've got the New York Times article in here, Tom Friedman and everything else like that. And here, Ambassador Canada's in there. We're going to get 301. We're going to get you. You better agree by Friday night at midnight. We're going to get you with 301. And the Secretary of Treasury, read the Friedman article in the New York Times, says, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. Nothing's going to happen. Not any real retaliation. Don't worry, and everything else. So you're doing a wonderful job under the pressures of trying to go in two different directions at the same time with the administration. Section 301, you keep saying nothing without our consent. And for Senator Rockefeller, you read it again. Nothing without our consent. This is what we're debating, our consent. And under that consent, you say you can't force Congress to change any law when they find against us. No, we don't change any law. They can't force us to. You're right. But they can bring then retaliation. And they got cross-sector retaliation. And like you were talking about financial services with the Japanese, they can come back and retaliate on automobiles. Have nothing to do with financial services. So don't act like, well, Congress is in power, Congress is in control, when we see what's going to happen to us, and they can cross-sector retaliate against us. I'm waiting on Senator Burns. He said he's coming right back.
Right there.
Yeah, here's Senator Burns, because we've got several others to move along and another very important witness. Excuse me, Senator Burns.
Senator, Mr. Chairman, if I could just five very quick comments.
Yeah, by all means.
I apologize.
Yeah,
I will not. Now, Senator Burns, I apologize for.
No, that's all right. No, you should. You got it.
This tariff cut will result in a net revenue gain for the United States Treasury, $3 in gain for every $1 in loss. Every study shows it. Number two, there was no study ever done by USTR. That study was done by an ex-employee of USTR in private life between the time this employee under the previous administration left that administration and then came back for a few months. This employee was in another occupation working for a private company. And if I had the study, Mr. Chairman, I would hand it to you today. Number three.
That's right.
Number three. There are only 1.6 million people employed in the textile and apparel industry in this entire United States.
Right.
Production is up, exports are up, higher than imports. The fact is we are competing and winning in the world economy right now. Number four.
That's why Milliken's going to China and Greenwood Mills in my state is going to Pakistan. Look, I'm talking from hard experience. We know what we're talking about. I mean,
Number
they're not
4.
up. We used to have 4 million textile jobs. Go ahead.
Number 4, in our letter during the NAFTA, we said we would make every effort, and frankly, I met for hours with the textile industry in Geneva to get 15 years. But I'll tell you what we did get. The previous administration wanted to cut textile tariffs, as you know, by 50%. The cuts amounted, when we finished, at 11%. We only got 10 years in the MFA phase-out, not 15. Frankly, I regret that, Mr. Chairman. I worked as hard as I could. Sometimes in this life, there are trade-offs that you have to be involved in. And last, on cross-sector retaliation, that's in our interest. We have the largest intellectual property industry in the world. In our copyright industries alone, movies, music, authors, and so on, we have 5 million Americans employed. We can't retaliate when we're being abused in other countries under present law because there is not big enough industries in those sectors in other countries. With cross-retaliation, we can make these laws and these obligations we've talked about here stick. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Burns.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, welcome, and you'll be about 10 pounds lighter when you go to lunch today. And
I can hardly afford to lose 10 more pounds, Senator.
I would say this, and I still have some. I still have a lot of questions about what we negotiated with Canada, and but going back to the old Canadian Free Trade, and we've got to get that ironed out. And I wish we could get that done, just to quieten the fears. I live on a border. I don't worry about tariffs and tariff barriers. I worry about non-tariff barriers. Now let me make a case in point. It takes 6 hours to clear feeder cattle or fat cattle to come from Canada to the United States. It takes 30 days to send feeder cattle to Canada. Now that's a non-tariff barrier. When our trucks pull up to Canada, taking American goods into Canada, now we've come up with a little regulation that their tractors or the semis that's on the trucks are on front of these trailers, the wheelbase can't be over 244 inches long. I don't know what that's got to do with it, but nonetheless, that holds them up, so you better get a tractor out of Canada down here to hook on that trailer and get it up there. Non-tariff barriers. Now, we hear a lot about winners and losers, and I'm sorry that when we talk about it, we spend a lot of time talking about winners because everybody likes to talk about winners. And I'm kind of like a guy, you know, that when you get into that idea that a piano player in a marching band ain't going to make it. He's not going to be a winner. There has to be some losers. Who loses?
Interesting question, Senator. What's interesting about that, you assume this is a zero-sum game. In other words, everything that has a winner has to have a loser.
Well, I'm saying...
Well, let me...
Yeah, okay.
And I understand your question.
Yeah.
First of all, let me say, I couldn't agree more with you on non-tariff barriers, and you and I have talked about this.
I know it.
And what we did on wheat with Canada and the agreement that we have now, at least for 1 year, and hopefully we're going to resolve that problem, is just one way of approaching a problem where we were being hammered by the Canadians because of their wheat board. And we worked together on that, and I think we came up with at least preliminarily and temporarily a solution that works. Now, we've got a lot of work ahead of us to make that permanent. 2, we've got to address these non-tariff barriers, whether it's with Canada or anyone else, and you're absolutely correct. I couldn't agree with you more. Number 3, is everyone going to win at the same rate under this agreement? Of course not. Of course not. But is the country going to win? Do we all win when we grow jobs and raise standard of living and create more high-skilled, high-wage jobs and create 192,000 more people in agriculture employed because of this agreement? Create $8.7 billion more in income to agriculture by the year 2005? Of course we are. Does wheat gain as much as corn? Does dairy gain as much as pork? The fact is no. But do we all go up together? The answer is yes. And so when you look for losers, the losers would be if we don't ratify this, implement this legislation, go forward and grow our economy. We all lose in that situation.
Well, I'm just wondering how I go home and tell my farmers that they're going to be winners when they're selling their wheat today at the same level as they sold it in 1948. When is this country ever going to listen to that? We can't do that, and we just cannot do that anymore without this exodus from the rural areas to the cities that puts pressure on our social fabric as far as our cities are concerned. I don't know how to level that.
I agree with you. No, I think this is important. You and we have no disagreement. Let me say 2 or 3 things about that. Number one, this administration has committed itself, as you know, just 2 days ago or 3 days ago, to putting $600 million more into green box programs and refocusing our EAT program into promotion and expansion, not just to take care of unfair trade practice. I think that's a major change. And number 3, we've committed ourselves to hold the agricultural budget steady in the next 2 years. That's also a major commitment by this administration. Number 4, with minimum access, current access, tariffication, which gets rid of non-tariff barriers in this agreement, which you are talking about, with making sure that we lower export subsidies, which the Europeans by volume must reduce much more than the United States. We're helping agriculture in this country. Now, you raise the right question. Does one get as much as the other? Look, there are always going to be some differences in commodity groups, but if you had seen the press conference I saw yesterday, was privileged to take part in, where almost every commodity group in this country stood up and said, we need the Uruguay round, I think you would have been as impressed as I was of the almost unanimous support in the country of the agricultural sector for this agreement.
Well, I'm in complete agreement with you, and I'm probably a free trader, but I think the majority of people at production agriculture would like to get their paycheck at the marketplace rather than from a government or anything with subsidies or EEPs or anything else, because the EEP, the only thing that does is kind of help out the exporting companies. Sure. We have a difference in how we market. Here, individual producers market their crop. They have to take on the Canadian government, so to speak. And we have to take on the European Economic Community, so to speak. But we're still pretty individuals out here because we have to market our crop. But we've got also things like futures and future contracts and this type of thing to sort of hedge into that. But it hasn't helped farm income. And if you think farm income's any better at $35 hogs and $3 wheat with all the expenses, then I've got to give you a lesson in economics as far as agriculture is concerned. Now, I want to ask Mr. Chairman one other question. I thank you for that. I happen to believe there's going to be some losers. I'm just like you in this thing. I haven't really identified who they are yet, but I have a hunch. Mr. Chairman, I think with regard to the personal communications, I would like to hear from Mr. Hunt at the FCC before this committee with regard to this agreement, and I think we should ask him some questions about that area, because it seems to me there's quite an area of concern and disagreement with regard to that part of this agreement. And so I appreciate that. And I appreciate Ambassador Cantor. We work together on a lot of things, and we look forward to working with you again on some things.
Thanks, Senator. You said something that implied I was I don't know. I think free trade protectionism is a sterile debate. I hope that this president, this trade representative, this Congress on both sides, we're smart traders, not free or traders or protectionists.
Well, it's every now and again, though, we never play from the same rule book, and that's what we've got to get down to somewhere.
You're absolutely correct. I agree with you.
Ambassador Cantor, the committee is indebted to you. We're going to leave the record open. There were several senators had some questions, but we've only got an equal amount of time or less than equal for another important witness, and we do appreciate your appearance here this morning, and the record is open for anything you wish to add or any questions by the members.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, and to all the members of the committee, thank you for your kindnesses and courtesy.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir James Goldsmith, please come forward. You say he fought in the British Army? I have a world citizen, Sir James Goldsmith, fought in the British Army, a citizen of the United Kingdom, a citizen of France, presently a member of the European Parliament, president of the parliamentary group, l'Europe des Nations, and a member of the parliamentary committee concerned with global trade and the Committee on External Economic Relations. I was moved by a conference that I attended with Sir James, and I'm reminded what Robert Hutchins said of education. He said the purpose of education was to unsettle the minds of youth and inflame their intellects. I hope you can do that for Senator Sir James. You are welcome here before the committee. We'd be delighted to hear from you at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I will respond to some of the points raised by Ambassador Cantor.
And move that microphone directly in front because I want to be sure it comes from. Yes, sir.
Is that better, sir? I would like to respond, if I may, Mr. Chairman, to some of the points raised by Ambassador Cantor. He pointed out that the Uruguay rounds started the negotiations 8 years ago. He also said that the economic future of this country and the developed world, in fact, depends on being able to compete with the world, his words. He also said that it was necessary to have a level playing field in trade. And those are 3 points I'd like to address. Firstly, since the Uruguay round started 8 years ago, the world has changed totally. The Berlin Wall has fallen. 4 billion people who previously had been separated from the world economy have joined the world economy. Chinese, Indians, Indo-Chinese, Vietnamese, Indonesians, Bangladeshis, skilled and hard-working people. On top of that, today technology can be transferred instantaneously anywhere on a microchip. And also capital can be transferred anywhere instantaneously wherever it will earn the highest return. So we are facing today a wholly new set of circumstances. 4 billion new people who have access to the same technology and the same capital. I was, by the way, surprised when Ambassador Cantor mentioned that the difference, I think it was not to you, sir, but it might be, mentioned that the workforces in these countries would be able to outcompete us only on wage costs, not on things such as technology and access to capital. The reality is capital is moving there very fast, and so is technology. But in this new world, I would like you to think as to whether or not, in common sense terms, there's a level playing field. I came from business. I've worked in most of these countries long before free trade existed. And I'm a free trader on a regional basis, and I've always been for free markets and free enterprise. But I'd like you to think about it in straightforward, common sense terms. Think, Mr. Chairman, of 2 enterprises. One here in America or in the developed world, and one in Vietnam or in the Philippines or in China. And they are both making the same products to be sold in the same markets using the same technology, having access to the same capital. The only element which distinguishes one from the other is that one can employ 47 able people for the cost of one person in the developed world, the United States or France, from where I come. Now, forget all the figures and the theories and the macroeconomics. Just think, Mr. Chairman, in terms of straightforward common sense as would be applied by a businessman. Where is that businessman going to establish his plant? Is it going to be in the place where he can employ 47 people for the price of one, who on top of that have no protection, no trade unions, none of the obligations, they don't seek the obligations which exist in other developed countries, or are they going to establish them in our countries? The answer is obvious, and that is what is happening. And so, what is the result? Let us imagine that we are head of a company, of an enterprise here in the United States or in France. And that corporation has sales, say, of $500 million. And it is in a normal form of industry. Now, we've been told all along that labor is not a major factor, that the cost of labor is not important. We've heard over and over again that the words that we use is wages are not the only factor. Now, in fact, the reality is that depending on the developed country, wages, the cost of employment, including social cost, is between 25 and 30% of volume in normal companies. That means that if you have a company with $500 million of sales, Mr. Chairman, and you decide to move offshore your production and just keep your sales and marketing here in the United States, you can save from 15 to 20% of sales volume and take it straight into profit. That means that you can increase your profits by up to $100 million just by moving offshore. So what are we saying, Mr. Chairman? We are saying that we are going to bring in a system, an economic system, whereby if an enterprise decides to stay in his home country, in the developed world, and employ his staff, he's going to be punished by bankruptcy because he cannot compete with imports. But if he decides to eliminate his own workforce in his own country and move offshore so as to re-import the products, he is going to be given a huge bonus of up to 20% of sales, up to $100 million per annum. Vast. So we have this extraordinary economic system where we give a huge reward to the one who leaves and we penalize, indeed bankrupt, the one who stays. Now, what is the answer to that? The people who object to that point of view say, but that's nonsense because the high-tech industries are going to compensate. Well, firstly, structurally, that can't be true. Because a high-tech industry, because of its automation, employs only very few people. That's the automatic, architectural, structural result of employing very few people. So if they employ very few people, how are they going to employ very many? How can they compensate for the very many who lose their jobs? And in any case, as soon as those high-tech companies start employing people, they immediately move offshore. And in the last few weeks, there's some examples. And if I may, I will quote them to you. There's IBM announced in early August, moving offshore. And interestingly, I believe they said that they were moving offshore with a partner, and they were not going to employ directly employees as IBM employees, so that if they could find even cheaper sources of labor, they'd move on there. And if I may, I'll come back to that point. Boeing, an aircraft manufacturer, Hewlett-Packard, moved to Malaysia and thinking of moving to cheaper places. Advanced Micro Devices, These are the people who created Silicon Valley. These are not standard normal technology companies. These are the high-tech companies. So the answer that high-tech companies will compensate, Mr. Chairman, if I may be so brutal, is nonsense, proven by facts, by reality. Then they come back and they say to you, service industries will compensate. Well, let's look at that, Mr. Chairman. Out there now, there are satellites. You can keep in constant communication with offices anywhere in the world. Companies, corporations with large back offices are moving their back offices offshore and keeping in communication through satellites and reducing costs by 80 or 90%. In Europe, the most staid of companies, Swiss Air, has moved a large part of its accounts department to Bombay. So there is no particular replacement for the movement offshore. And the alternatives that are being proposed, you have two. You have two policies. One which we've talked about, you talked about here this morning in your committee, Mr. Chairman, and that is becoming competitive. And the other is trying to maintain a social society without reducing wages. Now, in the United States, in fact, I have the figure. We were talking about reduction of wages. Since 1973, these official government figures, in inflation-adjusted figures, the weekly earnings in the United States are down by 19.2%. So by adjusting what you've done before NAFTA and before GATT is to try and compete by reducing the standard of living. Now, in the good old days, it was thought that the purpose of an economy was to create prosperity, not poverty. Mr. Henry Ford